4. Dogs and ponies. As everyone knows, every boy must have a dog, especially if he lives on a farm. I had a number of dogs during my boyhood days. It was strange about that, though. I never seemed to be able to keep one for very long. Something always happened to them. Some were run over by cars on the highway, some were poisoned, others ran away. I had always wanted a collie dog, and I finally got one. He was only a few weeks old when we brought him home, and a few days later disaster fell again. Mother was late that evening as she got into the car and started down to Uncle Harv's to help with the milking. The little collie was asleep directly in front of the wheels of the car, and Mother did not know it. The noise of the car did not awaken the pup. It was a pitiful accident that hurt Mother as much as it did me. I think we gave up having dogs for a while after that. We acquired an Indian pony for a while, and I claimed title to him. He wasn't much good for anything but a toy for a child. He was small and scrawny and very bony. We had no saddle or bridle, so I had to learn to ride him bareback with only a hackamore to rein him. When he walked, we got along fine. When he trotted or galloped, it was a different story. How many times I fell off the bundle of bones would be difficult to count, but they were many. Fortunately, the protruding bones on his rear legs acted as a ladder, and I was able to remount alone. Whenever I would fall off, he would stop and wait for me to remount. I was rarely ever left to walk home on foot. The first colt to be born on the farm was given to me. We lived together during the first few months after it was born. I started riding him when he was hardly able to walk. Dad put a stop to this, and I had to wait until he grew up before pursuing the companionship further. When he was finally old enough to ride, Dad got a little saddle for me. It was an old one, and the cinch had been worn out. A new cinch was made from gunny sacks folded in a number of times. It held up for some time until the cloth began to fall apart. One day while galloping down the road from the barn to the house, the cinch broke, and the saddle and I both fell off, and I was half buried in the loose dirt on the road. The loose dirt was thick enough to help cushion the fall, but falling head first into the dirt made quite a mess of me. It was hard to tell where the road stopped and I began. The fall also knocked me unconscious for a short time. To the best of my recollection, that is the only time I was ever knocked unconscious. We had named the colt Strawberry. He was still much too young to be of value on the farm, so Dad decided to send him up to Uncle Lester's ranch until he was old enough to be used for work. We couldn't afford to buy feed for a colt that only I could ride. The decision was made, and Strawberry was shipped off. I had lost my best friend. There is a weed in Arizona and elsewhere that is known as loco weed. The term loco is a Mexican term meaning crazy. Horses and cattle that eat it in too great a quantity often go loco, as the term implies. This is what happened to my little pony Strawberry. I was never to see him again. 5. Boots and Knives. One of the great joys of childhood is to splash through mud puddles. Whether the feet are bare or have shoes on makes little difference. Unfortunately, parents seldom share this enthusiasm. On a farm, you didn't have to wait for a thunder shower to make the puddles of dirt and water available. Irrigation was necessary every week or so, and the water often flooded areas other than the fields. Dad, in his irrigation boots, could tramp off through the water and mud at will, and I could not. It was a very enviable situation. Then one day I received my first pair of rubber boots. Had they been made of pure gold, they would not have been valued more. I was finally the master of the water and mud. The boots were worn constantly, whether at home or at school. I suppose I would have worn them to Sunday school also, if Mother had allowed it. One day, while wearing the boots, with shovel in hand, an attempt was made to dig a hole. The ground was hard as a rock at the spot I was digging, and the shovel was being raised high in the air and brought down with as much strength as possible. Lacking skill, my aim was not so good, and with one mighty thrust the shovel came down on the end of my boot. The shovel severed the boot top and nearly cut the end off my big toe. It was a hard lesson, for even though the toe healed, the boots were not so easily replaced. A pocket knife, even today, has always been a part of my attire. I remember many knives throughout my childhood. Probably the first disaster resulting from one was there on the farm. While innocently whittling on a piece of wood, the knife slipped, as they often do, and I severed the end of my left index finger. It cut the flesh down to the bone. The scar that remains, even now, has distorted the fingerprint to such an extent that identification by it is quick and positive. (6) Robert Dean. On March 15th, 1930, Robert Dean Pew was born into the family. He was born a normal, healthy child, full of energy and activity. From the time he was able to walk, he had a strong will to stray from the house and Mother's watchful eyes. Although he was most often punished for his willful ways, he continued them whenever possible. More than once he would be found a quarter of a mile away, standing by the busy Phoenix Mesa highway, watching the speeding cars go by. Punishment was usually in the form of switching to his legs. It would sting badly and leave temporary marks, but the lesson was never a lasting one. Mother even tried tying him up outside on a length of rope to keep him at home, but he nearly always found a way to untie the rope and run away. When Dean was 3 years of age, the greatest tragedy of our family's life was to have its beginning. While Dean was a baby, either Mother or Virginia would stay at the house with him in the morning, while the rest of the family would go to milk the cows. In the evening, Dean would be taken to the milk barn with us and put in a walker for safekeeping. The floor of the milk barn was of concrete. One evening he fell out of the walker on his head. Although the injury didn't seem serious at the time, it apparently caused injury to his brain from which he was never to recover. There are other reasons that affected his lack of recovery that will not be told at this time, but in another part of this story. As it became apparent that more than a bump on the head had occurred, Mother and Dad took him to every doctor in the area without obtaining any real help. He was taken to specialist after specialist with no further help. Finally, an attempt to get him to the Mayo Clinic was undertaken. After hearing the story, they refused, saying there was nothing they could do for him. The remaining 11 years of his life were spent in a state of mental childhood. Mother has always been a woman of devout religious convictions. She has great faith and much humility. She knew that if doctors could not heal Dean, she could through faith and prayer. She has always been close to the Lord, and she prayed often for his help. Many years later, while Dean was still alive, but a complete invalid, she told me a strange story. While still on the farm, Mother prayed night and day for Dean's recovery. Dad was not a devoted man to his religion, and so little strength was added to the plea for Dean's recovery from him. One day while praying, a voice came to Mother saying, "You may have your choice of Dean's recovery or your husband's life." The choice was nearly more than Mother could accept. Mother loved Dad dearly, and certainly could not give him up, so she stopped pleading with the Lord for Dean. I'm sure that even then she could not completely give up hope. Even so, Dean was to retain the intelligence of an infant, and even submit to being a helpless invalid during the last few years of his life. More than a year has passed since beginning this narrative, and 9 months since the last entry. Survival in this busy life leaves little time to ponder yesterday's childhood memories. When at home, time never permits this recluse into the past. Only on trips such as this, with a day or evening to spare, can the record be continued. 7. Sundays. Days on the farm were not all filled with despair. Although the tragedy of Dean covered us with a cloak of sorrow, life continued and adjustments were made. Faithfulness to our church activities was probably greater during the years on the farm than it was during the 10 years that followed. Few clear memories remain of any significance. We attended the Mesa Fourth Ward, located on the Mesa-Phoenix Highway, about a half-mile east of the Alma Cross Road. This was in the direction of town. I remember vaguely the uncarpeted floors of the chapel and the rows of small chairs in front where the children sat. I generally sat on the left side, facing front, south, near the old upright piano. The bishop was Alma Davis, the owner of the dairy, cattle, and property Uncle Harv lived on. I believe without certainty that Harv was a counselor in the bishopric for some time. Sunday morning we would all dress in our Sunday best, get into the old Franklin, and off we'd go. The return home at noon was more jubilant than the departure, for it generally meant freezing ice cream or sherbet. This was always a happy occasion. Sunday school and primary teachers are ghosts of the past without memory. None can I remember, although to them I owe much of the early religious teachings received.